The morning Jacob Miller stepped outside to check the sky, he noticed the ice on the water barrel had not melted overnight, despite the fact that April's sun had been shining for 3 days straight. It was April 3rd, 1847, in the hills 11 miles northeast of what would eventually become Gainesville, Missouri. Spring should have been establishing itself by now. The warming that came gradually but reliably after winter's end, the softening of frozen ground, the first tentative green appearing in sheltered places. Jacob had lived through 37 winters in these hills and knew the rhythms of seasons as well as he knew the layout of his own farm. But the ice remained. Thick and solid, the same thickness it had been in February when serious cold had settled in. He touched it with his finger, felt the absolute cold of it, the kind of cold that belonged to deep winter rather than early April, when the sun rose higher each day and stayed longer in the sky. His wife, Rebecca, came to the door, their youngest son, Thomas, balanced on her hip. She looked at Jacob's face, read concern there, and asked, "What's wrong?" "The ice hasn't melted," he said, gesturing toward the barrel. Rebecca looked at it, then at the sky, clear and bright, the kind of sky that should bring warmth even if the air held some coolness from night. "That's strange," she said. "Yes," Jacob agreed. It was such a small thing. Ice that should have melted but hadn't. Not alarming by itself, not dangerous, just wrong in the way that small violations of expected patterns were wrong. Jacob had more pressing concerns. Fields that needed to be prepared for planting. Fence repairs that winter damage required. The 100 tasks that spring farming demanded. But the ice bothered him. He stood looking at it for a long moment, trying to understand why this small wrongness felt significant, why his instincts were telling him to pay attention to something as minor as frozen water in April. The Miller farm sat in a valley that 3 other families shared, the Carters to the north, the Weavers to the east, and old Thomas Brennan, who lived alone in a small cabin at the southern edge of the cleared land. They were isolated by choice and by distance, families who had come to this territory when land was available and had stayed despite hardships that drove others back to settled areas. The winter of 1846 to 1847 had been harsh. Snow had fallen heavily from November through March, accumulating to depths that made travel difficult and isolation nearly complete. The families had prepared well, had supplies sufficient for extended confinement, had survived previous hard winters, and knew what endurance required. By late March, the worst appeared to be over. The snow had stopped falling, the days had grown noticeably longer, and the signs that spring was approaching had begun to appear. Birds returning, ice on the creek thinning, the quality of light changing in ways that marked seasonal transition. But now, 3 days into April, Jacob stood looking at ice that should not still be frozen, and felt unease that he could not name. Rebecca went back inside to attend to the children. Jacob walked to the creek that ran along the eastern edge of his property, the same creek he had checked daily through the winter to break ice and ensure his livestock had water. The creek should be running freely by now, the ice broken up and carried away by current that strengthened with spring melt. But the ice remained solid. Not just at the edges where shade kept some frozen patches longer, but completely solid, covering the creek from bank to bank with ice that was thick and white and absolutely frozen. Jacob stood on the bank, staring at water that should be flowing. The sun was warm on his face. He could feel it, could feel the heat that April sun created. But the ice did not respond to that warmth, did not show the softening and cracking that thaw created, did not acknowledge that winter should be ending. He walked to the Carter farm needing to know if they were seeing the same thing, needing confirmation that this wrongness was not something only he was experiencing. The walk took 20 minutes through snow that was still deep in places, though the path they had maintained between farms through the winter was packed and relatively easy to traverse. John Carter was outside his cabin, splitting firewood, work that needed to be done regardless of season or temperature. He looked up as Jacob approached, his weathered face showing the weariness that hard winters created. "Morning, Jacob," he called out. "Morning," Jacob replied. "You notice anything strange about the weather?" John set down his axe, wiped sweat from his forehead. "Strange how?" "The ice isn't melting. The creek's still frozen solid." John was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I noticed that. Thought maybe it was just a cold snap. A few more days of frost before the real thaw started. It's been 3 days of sun, 3 days of warmth. The ice should be melting." "Should be," John agreed, "but it's not." They stood together in silence, both of them understanding that should and were not aligning the way they needed to align, that the world was not responding to spring the way their experience told them it must. "You worried?" John asked. Jacob considered this. Was he worried, or just unsettled by a pattern that was slightly off, by a delay that might mean nothing more than that this particular spring was arriving late? "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I don't like it." "Winter's been hard," John said. "Maybe it's just taking longer to break. Give it another week, maybe 2. Spring will come." Jacob nodded, though the reassurance felt hollow. Spring always came. That was the fundamental truth that frontier farming depended on. Seasons changed, winter ended, planting time arrived. To doubt that was to doubt the basic structure of the world. But doubt was exactly what he felt as he walked back to his own farm, as he looked at ice that should be melting and snow that should be receding and ground that should be softening. Doubt that was small but persistent. Doubt that whispered that this spring might be different, that this winter might not be following the rules that all previous winters had followed. The next morning, April 4th, Jacob woke to find frost covering the inside of the cabin windows. Not light frost, not the thin coating that cold nights sometimes left even in early spring, but heavy frost, thick and white, and rhymed in patterns that belonged to deep winter. Rebecca stood at the window looking at it, her breath visible in air that should have been warming, but that held the sharp cold of February. "Jacob," she said quietly, "this isn't right." He joined her at the window, touched the frost, felt the absolute cold of it. The cabin should have retained some warmth from the fire they kept burning through the night. The morning sun should be warming the air even if slowly. But the cold was intense, pressing, the kind of cold that hurt lungs and made fingers ache. Their 3 children, Sarah age 10, Benjamin age 7, and Thomas age 4, were still asleep under the heavy quilts that winter required. Jacob added wood to the fire, building it up to produce heat that would make the cabin comfortable, and watched the flames catch and burn, without seeming to warm the air as much as fire should warm enclosed space. "We should check on the others," Rebecca said. "Make sure everyone's managing." Jacob nodded. This was reasonable. This was what neighbors did when weather was difficult. But he felt reluctance that had nothing to do with the cold and everything to do with not wanting to confirm that others were experiencing the same wrongness, that this was not isolated to his farm, but was affecting the entire valley. He dressed in the heavy coat and fur hat that deep winter required, stepped out into morning that was bright with sun, but cold with February temperatures. The sky was clear, perfectly clear, the kind of clarity that should mean warming air and melting snow. But the air was bitter, the cold penetrating despite layers of clothing. He walked to the Weaver farm first, following the path that use had maintained through months of winter travel. The Weavers were a larger family, David and Martha and their 5 children, ranging from 16-year-old Daniel to the baby Elizabeth, who had been born in December during the hardest part of winter. Martha was at the door before Jacob could knock, her face showing the same concern he felt. "You've noticed," she said. "The cold," Jacob confirmed, "and the ice not melting? Come in." The Weaver cabin was crowded with family, warm from the large fire burning in the hearth, filled with the noise that many children created. But Martha's face held worry that the normalcy could not hide. "David's been saying it's just a late spring," she said quietly, leading Jacob away from where the children played. "Says we're worrying over nothing. That April can still be cold sometimes." "Can it be this cold?" Jacob asked. "Can the ice stay frozen when the sun's been shining for days?" Martha shook her head. "I don't know. I've never seen a spring like this. But David's right that we can't panic over weather. That's unusual. We have supplies to last. We can wait." Waiting was what frontier life taught. Patience through seasons that were hard. Endurance through conditions that were difficult. Faith that patterns would hold because patterns always held. But Jacob left the Weaver farm with doubt growing, rather than diminishing, with the sense that waiting might not be enough if this winter had become something other than winter, if the season had stopped following the rules that made survival through it possible, because the end was guaranteed. He visited Thomas Brennan next, the old man who lived alone at the southern edge of the valley. Brennan was 72 years old, had lived in these hills longer than anyone else, had survived winters that had driven younger families away. Brennan was outside when Jacob arrived, standing in the yard looking at the sky with an expression that made Jacob's unease deepen. "You've noticed," Brennan said, not greeting, just statement. "The ice," Jacob said, "and the cold. Not just that. Everything. The way the snow sits, the way the air feels." Brennan's voice was rough from age and solitude. "I've lived through 47 winters in these hills. Never seen one quite like this. You think it's—" Jacob started. "I don't know what I think," Brennan interrupted, "but I know it's not right." Jacob wanted to argue, wanted to dismiss the old man's words as superstition or confusion brought on by isolation and age. But he had felt it too, the sense that the cold was not just temperature, but presence, that the winter was not just season, but something with awareness and intent. He returned to his own farm, troubled in ways he could not explain to Rebecca, worried by observations that seemed too insubstantial to share yet too consistent to ignore. The ice had not melted. The frost had not lifted. The cold had not broken despite sun that should be bringing warmth. That night, the temperature dropped further. By morning of April 5th, new snow was falling. Not the light dustings that could occur even in early spring, not the brief squalls that came and went without accumulation. Heavy snow, falling steadily, adding inches to what already covered the ground. Winter, snow, deep winter snow, the kind that belonged to January or February, but that was falling in April, when planting should be beginning and life should be returning to frozen ground. Jacob stood at the window, watching it fall, and felt fear that was deeper than any fear winter itself had created. Winter was hard, but winter was finite. Winter tested, but winter ended. Winter killed the unprepared, but winter always gave way to spring for those who survived it. But this winter was not ending. This winter was intensifying, was returning with renewed force, was demonstrating that the rules Jacob had built his life around might not apply anymore. Rebecca came to stand beside him, watching the snow accumulate. "How long can we last?" she asked quietly. "We have supplies for another month, maybe 6 weeks if we're careful," Jacob said. After that, he did not finish the sentence. After that, they would need spring, would need the garden to produce, the hunting to improve, the foraging to become possible again, would need the season to change so that life could continue in ways that winter made impossible. "We'll be all right," Rebecca said, though her voice carried no conviction. "Spring will come. It has to come." But nothing said it had to come. Nothing guaranteed that seasons would change just because they always had before. The world operated according to patterns until it didn't, followed rules until something made those rules stop applying. The snow fell for 3 days. By April 8th, the accumulation had added another foot to what already lay on the ground, burying the small signs of spring that had begun to appear, covering everything in fresh white that looked exactly like the snow that had fallen in the depths of winter. The 4 families gathered at the Weaver farm on April 9th, needing to see each other, needing to share supplies and strategies and the comfort of community. 16 people crowded into the cabin that was already tight with the Weavers, themselves, and in the press of bodies and the noise of children, there was momentary illusion of normalcy. But when the adults gathered to talk while the children played, the fear was evident in every face. "We're burning through firewood faster than we planned," David Weaver said. "I cut enough for winter, but I was counting on being able to cut more in spring. If the cold continues, we'll run short." "Food's the same," John Carter added. "We rationed for winter, expected to supplement with spring hunting and fishing. If we can't do that, we share what we have," Jacob said. "Pool resources, make sure everyone has enough to last until conditions change." "What if conditions don't change?" Martha Weaver asked quietly. The question hung in the warm air of the cabin, unanswerable and terrifying. What if the winter did not end? What if spring did not come? What if this cold continued through April, through May, through the months when survival depended on the growing season, that cold made impossible? "Spring will come," David said firmly. "It always comes. This is just delayed, unusual, but it will come." Thomas Brennan, sitting apart from the others, spoke up in his rough voice. "You're wrong." Everyone turned to look at him. "This winter isn't delayed," Brennan continued. "It's changed. It's become something it wasn't supposed to be, and I don't think it's going to leave just because we want it to." "That's superstition," David said, though his voice lacked the certainty his words claimed. "Is it superstition when the ice doesn't melt in April sun? Is it superstition when snow falls heavier in spring than it did in winter? Is it superstition when you can feel the cold watching you?" "Cold doesn't watch," John Carter said. "This cold does," Brennan replied. They talked through the afternoon, making plans for rationing, for sharing labor, for supporting each other through however long this strange weather lasted. They agreed to check on each other regularly, to pool firewood and food if shortages developed, to stay together in whatever was happening. But underneath the practical planning was fear that none of them wanted to name, that their supplies were finite, that their endurance had limits, that survival through extended winter depended on spring arriving before resources ran out. Jacob and his family walked home through falling snow that showed no signs of stopping, through cold that was as intense as any cold February had brought. Sarah walked beside him, quiet in the way children became when they sensed adult fear. Benjamin and Thomas rode on their parents' backs, too young to understand but old enough to feel the tension. The weeks that followed established a pattern that was routine without being normal. The snow continued falling intermittently, sometimes stopping for a few days before resuming. The cold remained constant, deep winter cold that should not exist in April, but that persisted without moderation. The sun rose higher in the sky each day, marking the passage of time toward summer. But the light it brought carried no warmth, created no thaw, changed nothing about the winter that held the valley. By early May, supplies were running low. The firewood Jacob had cut in autumn was nearly exhausted. The food stores that should have lasted until gardens produced were diminishing toward insufficiency. The animals were suffering. Chickens that had survived winter were dying now from cold that extended beyond their endurance. The cow that provided milk was giving less as feed ran short. The families met again, taking stock of collective resources, calculating how long they could continue. The numbers were not encouraging. Another month, perhaps 6 weeks, if they rationed strictly, and if no one fell ill or injured in ways that required additional resources. "We should send someone for help," Martha Weaver suggested. "Someone should go to the settlement, bring back supplies, or at least bring back word that this isn't happening everywhere." "The settlement's 40 miles, David said, "through snow that's deeper now than it was in January, through cold that's killed animals that were adapted to it. Whoever goes might not make it." "And if we don't go, we definitely won't make it," Martha replied. They debated through the afternoon, the risks of sending someone versus the certainty of starvation if spring did not come soon. The question of who would go, who was strong enough, experienced enough, expendable enough if the journey failed. Daniel Weaver volunteered. He was 16, strong from farm work, capable in winter conditions. David refused initially, unwilling to risk his oldest son, but Daniel insisted. Someone had to try. Someone had to do something other than wait for a spring that showed no signs of arriving. They prepared as well as they could, gathering what food could be spared, what warm clothing they had, what supplies the journey would require. Daniel would leave in the morning, would attempt to reach the settlement, would bring back help if help existed. That night, the temperature dropped to levels they had not experienced even in the depths of winter. The cold was so intense that the fire in Jacob's hearth seemed to produce no warmth, seemed to burn without heating the air around it. Frost formed on the inside walls of the cabin, thick and white and spreading as they watched. Rebecca gathered the children close, wrapping them in every quilt and blanket they owned. Jacob fed the fire continuously, burning wood they could not spare in a desperate attempt to create enough warmth to survive the night. By morning, the cold had eased, slightly, but word came that Daniel Weaver had died in the night. Jacob helped bury him that afternoon, breaking ground that was frozen solid. They worked in silence, the cold making speech difficult, the fact of death making words seem insufficient. After the burial, the family stood together briefly, then returned to their separate cabins. There was nothing to say that would change what had happened or what might happen next. The days that followed were marked by quiet fear. The families continued rationing, continued maintaining fires. The cold remained constant. The snow continued falling. By late May, when Jacob made his rounds between cabins, he found the Brennan place silent. By June, the Weaver cabin had gone still. The Carter family had left, heading south through snow that showed no signs of stopping. The Miller family was alone in the valley now. The cold that had been difficult became unbearable. Supplies ran out, The fire burned lower each day. In mid-July, Jacob and Rebecca sat together in their cabin. The children were quiet. The world outside was white and still and would not change. They had done what could be done, and it had not been enough. In October of 1847, when the first snows of autumn began falling, a hunting party passing through the hills found the valley. They found cabins standing silent. They found bodies. They found messages marking days that stretched from April into July while snow continued falling. They found no explanation for why winter had persisted in this valley when everywhere else spring and summer had come normally. The valley was abandoned. No one could say why the cold had concentrated there. Some said geography. Some said nothing. The valley is still avoided.